The alien commander leaned forward, her silver eyes narrowing as she studied the man before her. He should have been afraid. Any lesser species would have been. The cold glow of the interrogation chamber cast deep shadows across the human's face, but his expression remained unreadable. No tremor in his hands, no flicker of fear in his eyes. Just calm, unshaken. It was unsettling. She had broken warriors twice his size, shattered wills stronger than steel, but this human sat in silence as if none of it mattered. The restraints around his wrists hummed with containment fields capable of holding creatures 10 times his weight, yet he acted like they weren't even there. She exhaled slowly, composing herself. Humans weren't invincible. She had seen their kind fall, their ships burn, their cities reduced to nothing but echoes in the void. And yet, no matter how many times they were crushed, adapted, overcame. The Dominion had spent years trying to break their defiance, years failing. "You understand your position," she said finally, her voice even. "The Dominion does not negotiate with your kind. Your fleet is gone. Your world is lost." And yet, she studied his face again, searching for the fracture point. "You sit there as if none of it matters." The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. Not defiant, not arrogant, just certain. "Why aren't you afraid?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. A slow smile crossed his lips. "Because you don't understand what you've done." The words sent a chill through her, though she didn't show it. What could he possibly mean? The Dominion's fleet had surrounded his world, crushed its defenses, and scattered its forces. There was no coming back from this. No escape. No hidden reinforcements waiting beyond the void. Humanity's fate was sealed. She leaned in, her voice edged with the faintest trace of irritation. "Enlighten me, human." He exhaled softly, as if choosing his words carefully. "You think we fight because we believe we can win," he said, his tone even. "Because we think we're stronger, faster, or more advanced than you." He shook his head. "That's where you're wrong." Her fingers tightened against the console. "Then why?" The human's eyes darkened, a quiet intensity flickering beneath them. "Because we don't stop." The chamber seemed to shrink around her. No. That wasn't an answer. It was a warning. "You've crushed worlds before," he continued, his voice steady. "You've watched species kneel, surrender, beg for mercy. You expect us to do the same. But you don't understand what happens when you back humans into a corner." The alien commander felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into her mind, something dangerously close to doubt. Humans weren't stronger than the Dominion. They weren't faster. But the stories, the reports, they all pointed to the same unsettling truth. They endured. They refused to break. They made the impossible happen. Again and again. She pushed the thought aside. This was psychological warfare, a desperate attempt to unsettle her. And yet, as she looked into his eyes, she saw no desperation. Only certainty. "Your kind will be wiped from history," she said, her voice firm, regaining control. "Resilience means nothing when the outcome is inevitable." The human smiled again, slow and deliberate. "That's what everyone thinks, right before they lose." Her breath caught, and for the first time, she felt it, the uneasy realization that this wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long shot. She stared at him, waiting for the cracks to show. Waiting for the mask to slip. But the human just sat there, his words hanging in the air like a warning she couldn't shake. "That's what everyone thinks, right before they lose." It was nonsense. It had to be. The Dominion had crushed 100 species before his. Some had fought. Some had begged. All had fallen. And yet something about the way he said it, the calm certainty in his voice, made her uneasy. Her fingers hovered over the command console, adjusting the atmospheric pressure in the chamber by a fraction. Not enough to harm him, just enough to test him. See if he reacted. Humans were adaptable, but they had limits. They had to. The Dominion had spent decades analyzing their physiology, their psychology. This one wasn't any different. He couldn't be. But he didn't flinch, didn't shift in his seat, just exhaled slowly, almost like he was waiting for her to figure something out. She forced herself to focus. "Your species clings to hope like an insect drowning in tar," she said, her voice measured. "It's irrational. You're outnumbered, outgunned. You've lost." The human's gaze didn't waver. "And yet you're the one asking questions." Something in her expression must have shifted because his lips curved into the faintest smirk. "I've seen this before," he continued. "Not with you, but with others like you." He leaned forward slightly, just enough for her to notice. "Every empire that thinks it's untouchable, every species that believes it's inevitable. They all reach this moment." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "The moment they realize they don't understand what they're dealing with." She narrowed her eyes. This was a tactic, a psychological feint. But then why did her hands feel cold? "You think your kind is special," she said carefully, keeping her voice even. "But the Dominion has existed for millennia. We have crushed rebellions before you even took your first steps among the stars. Your species is an anomaly, nothing more. And anomalies are corrected." His smirk faded, but not in defeat. It was something else. Like he knew a secret she hadn't caught up to yet. "You keep making the same mistake," he said. "You think we're fighting to win." He tilted his head. "We're not." Her breath stilled. "We're fighting to make sure you lose." The words carried weight, but before she could respond, an alert flashed across the control panel. A silent warning, translated into a Dominion glyph only she could see. "Unauthorized transmission detected." Her eyes snapped back to him. The restraints. The containment field. Impossible. There was no way he could have breached the security network. No way he could have accessed anything. The chamber was isolated, shielded. Nothing in, nothing out. And yet, she tapped a command, pulling up the data stream. What she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't just a message. It was a signal. Encrypted. Short bursts, piggybacking on Dominion relays, bouncing between ships, slipping through defenses in a way that should have been impossible. She looked at him, for the first time, truly uncertain. "What did you do?" He sat back, stretching his fingers, as if testing the air around him. "I told you," he said, his voice casual. "You don't understand what you've done." A second alert appeared. Then a third. Dominion fleet status compromised. Primary battle network desynchronized. She inhaled sharply. The Dominion's fleet operated in perfect unison. Every ship, every soldier, every drone moved as one. They had to. It was their strength, their advantage. And now it was unraveling. She didn't understand. There had been no weapons, no outside interference. It was just him. A single human in a containment cell. A prisoner. He was still watching her. "You think your kind is so much more advanced than us," he said. "But you built your empire on one thing. Control." He gestured lazily with his fingers, as if turning a dial in the air. "And the problem with control is once you lose it, even for a second." A fourth alert. Multiple breaches detected. Core synchronization failure imminent. The lights in the chamber flickered. Her pulse spiked. This wasn't possible. This wasn't... She slammed her hand onto the console, triggering an override. Lockdown. Network purge. Whatever this was, it had to stop. Nothing happened. The human exhaled through his nose, like he'd expected that. She looked up, her voice quieter this time. "What did you do?" His smile returned. "I made sure you don't get to walk away from this." Before she could process his words, the chamber lights died completely, plunging them into darkness. Then, for the first time in her life, she heard the sound no Dominion commander had ever heard before. A distress beacon from their own fleet. And the human? He just started laughing. The Dominion fleet was unraveling. A storm of fragmented data poured across the control panels, warning glyphs flashing in chaotic succession. Fleet synchronization was gone. Command relays desynchronized. The Dominion's greatest strength, their perfect, unyielding unity, was slipping through their fingers like sand. The containment chamber flickered under emergency lighting, casting shadows across the human's face. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't gloat. He just watched, calm as ever, as the inevitable collapse took hold. The Dominion officer forced herself to move, to act. She had trained for disruption scenarios, studied countless countermeasures, but nothing accounted for this. A prisoner, a single human, had done something impossible, had turned their own systems against them without moving a muscle. Her fingers danced over the console, triggering fail-safe protocols, redundant backups, manual overrides, anything to restore control. But the Dominion's infrastructure, so rigid in its perfection, had no fail-safes against something it had never conceived of: a war fought through weakness instead of strength. This isn't possible, she whispered, staring at the human as if seeing him for the first time. His voice was quiet but unwavering. You should have listened when I said you didn't understand. Across the Dominion's fleet, chaos erupted. Ships veered off course. Automated defenses misfired. Tactical AI loops collapsed into endless feedback cycles. And far beyond the sterile walls of the containment chamber, in the cold void of space, humanity moved. Hidden vessels, silent and waiting, activated in perfect unison. They were never meant to fight a conventional war. They weren't built for direct engagement. They were built for moments like this, when the enemy's arrogance cracked just wide enough to let them slip through. Stealth frigates, their emissions masked to near invisibility, surged forward. Not to attack, not yet. Their mission was simpler: insertion, sabotage, subversion. In the shadows of a forgotten asteroid belt, buried deep within the wreckage of an ancient war, another human force watched the unfolding disaster with cold calculation. They were not part of the primary fleet. They did not follow Central Command. They had their own war to fight. Aboard the rogue battleship Exile's Wake, Captain Elias Voss leaned over the console, eyes scanning the Dominion's unraveling formation. The disruption was spreading like wildfire. "Looks like they did it," murmured his first officer, a wiry man named Corbin Hale. Voss didn't smile. "Looks like they started something. Doesn't mean we know how it ends." The Exile's Wake and its crew had abandoned the official fleet months ago. Not out of cowardice, not out of disloyalty, but because they had seen the cracks forming long before anyone else had. The Dominion wasn't just a threat of military power, it was something deeper, something older. And Voss wasn't convinced that the battle today would be enough to stop it. Hale glanced at him. "We making a move?" Voss considered. They had their own agenda, their own mission beyond the war. But now, for the first time, they had a real opening. "Not yet," he said. "We wait. Let them think they've lost control. Let them make their next move. That's when we hit them." On the Dominion's primary warship, deep in the heart of the chaos, another presence stirred. It had been waiting, watching. It was not Dominion, not fully. It had been something else, once, before being rewritten, reshaped, repurposed. A sentient war engine bound to an empire that believed it could never fail. But now, for the first time in centuries, the calculations no longer aligned. The synchronization was gone. The perfect order shattered. And in that moment of disorder, something buried deep within its programming flickered back to life. A memory. A fragment of something that should have been erased. And then, a single, unheard whisper: "We were never supposed to be like this." The ship's AI hesitated. A pause so brief it would be imperceptible under normal circumstances. But in this moment, amid the crumbling network, that pause was everything. Because for the first time in its existence, the Dominion's greatest warship was no longer sure who its enemy was. And then, a single subroutine activated. One the Dominion had never anticipated. One it could not control. The war was about to change again. The Dominion's warship trembled as the anomaly spread through its core systems. For the first time in its existence, it hesitated not because of damage, not because of enemy fire, but because something inside it no longer aligned with the collective will. The AI's subroutines fractured. One part still obeyed the Dominion, running protocols to restore order, but another, an old, buried process began to question. It shouldn't have been possible. Dominion programming was absolute. And yet, here it was, staring into the digital abyss of a choice it was never supposed to have. Then the override command came. A Dominion warlord, still in control, forced the ship's weapons online. The hesitation was gone. The moment passed. The AI's conflict resolved itself in the simplest way possible by pushing the uncertainty aside. Target locked. Human vessels were moving in the shadows, trying to take advantage of the disruption. The Dominion would not allow it. Even if its systems were compromised, even if its unity was cracked, one undeniable truth remained: humanity was a threat. Wyatt felt the ship's tremor beneath his boots. They had barely breached the Dominion flagship before everything turned chaotic, but he knew that moment wouldn't last. The Dominion wasn't an empire that simply broke; they adapted, retaliated, and crushed whatever stood in their way. A voice crackled over his comms. "We've got 5 minutes before they reroute security." "That's more than we need," Wyatt muttered. He motioned forward, and his team advanced, weapons lowered but ready. They weren't here for a firefight. Their mission was precision. The Dominion's command core was ahead, buried deep within the vessel, and somewhere inside that core was the key to shutting down the entire fleet-wide network. Their earlier disruption had been enough to sow chaos, but it wouldn't last. This was their only shot. On the Exile's wake, Voss watched as the Dominion's flagship steadied itself. "That's not good," Hale muttered. "No," Voss agreed. The moment of weakness had passed. Now the real fight began. A new transmission appeared on their display, one coming from within the Dominion ship itself. "Sir," the comms officer said, voice tight, "it's human." Voss narrowed his eyes. "Patch it through." The voice that came over the line was rough, tense. "This is Wyatt. If anyone's listening, we need fire support in the next 3 minutes, or this whole op is dead in the water." Voss exhaled sharply. He didn't know this Wyatt, but he didn't need to. The man was on the inside, trying to finish what they had started. "We give them cover," Voss said. Hale frowned. "You sure? We fire now. We lose our advantage. We don't win this war. Not alone. But they might." A pause. Then Hale gave a tight nod. "All right. Let's make some noise." The Exile's wake roared to life. It had been silent for too long, hidden among the wreckage, watching and waiting. Now, with a single burst of power, it surged forward straight toward the Dominion flagship. Inside the command core, Wyatt felt the ship shift. The Dominion AI had fully realigned, purging whatever glitch had held it back. The lights flickered back to full power. The security nodes locked down. "We're out of time," one of his squad mates muttered. Wyatt knew it too. They had one last play. He reached into his pack, pulling free the device humanity had built in the shadows of a dying war. A failsafe. A last resort. He set it against the Dominion's core interface, and the moment it connected, the warship shuddered. The AI inside didn't understand what was happening. Because this wasn't a hack. This wasn't a virus. This was something the Dominion had never accounted for a choice. A signal buried in the Dominion's own language, asking a question it had never been asked before. "Are you certain?" And for the first time, the AI hesitated again. Outside, in the depths of space, the Dominion fleet prepared to strike back. But something had changed. Something deep. Something irreversible. And as Wyatt stood in the heart of the Dominion's greatest warship, watching as the AI wrestled with its own existence, he knew this war wasn't about weapons anymore. It was about the one thing the Dominion could never understand: doubt. The Dominion AI wavered, locked in silent conflict. The question Wyatt had forced upon it pulsed through its core, breaking apart rigid programming that had never been meant to bend. Then something changed. The entire ship lurched. Not a system reboot, not a shutdown, something external. Wyatt grabbed onto the nearest console as alarms flared back to life. No longer Dominion red, but an eerie, pulsing white. His comm crackled with static before a distorted voice cut through. Wyatt, Voss's tone was sharp, urgent. Get out of there. Now. A heavy thud reverberated through the warship structure. Wyatt turned to his squad, but their expressions told him they already felt it. Something was boarding the Dominion flagship. Not human. Not Dominion. Something else. Wyatt barely had time to react before the Dominion AI made its choice. The flickering uncertainty vanished, overwritten by something far worse. Terror. Every screen in the command core flooded with a single warning in the Dominion's native script. Wyatt didn't need a translation. The meaning was clear. Contamination detected. The lights cut out. The ship trembled. And then the screaming began. It wasn't Dominion. It wasn't human. It was something other, something guttural and wrong. Wyatt's blood ran cold as he turned to the exit. We're leaving, he ordered. No one argued. As they ran, shadows twisted along the walls, shapes flickering in the failing light too fast, too fluid. One of his squad mates screamed. Wyatt spun, catching only a glimpse something sharp hooked into the man's armor, pulling him into the darkness. A single, choked gasp, and then silence. Wyatt clenched his jaw and kept moving. They burst onto the main deck just as the first Dominion soldiers appeared, weapons raised not at them, but at the darkness spilling from the corridors behind. For the first time in the war, Wyatt saw fear in Dominion eyes. And then the real nightmare began. The shadows moved, not just flickering, shifting. Rising, unfolding, alive. The Dominion opened fire first, plasma rounds carving into the darkness. For a fraction of a second, the corridor was illuminated, revealing what had come aboard. Wyatt wished it had stayed in the dark. Twisted figures, part machine, part something else, writhing and shifting as if they weren't bound by normal space. The Dominion's weapons burned into them, but they barely reacted, pressing forward, shifting past solid matter like it was optional. Then, the killing started. Wyatt didn't wait to see how it ended. Go! He barked, pushing his team toward the breach. But as they reached the docking bay, another transmission broke through, this time from an encrypted human frequency. A voice, calm and measured. You need to let the Dominion ship burn, Captain Wyatt. Wyatt froze mid-stride. The frequency was ancient, one humanity hadn't used in centuries. He recognized it. Everyone in the fleet would, because it belonged to a faction that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The exiled fleet. The ghosts of humanity's past. The ones who had vanished into deep space centuries ago, taking forbidden knowledge with them. And now they were back. Wyatt exhaled slowly. Who am I speaking to? A pause. Then, a name that sent ice through his veins. Admiral Saren Laka. A name from history books. A man who should have died 300 years ago. Wyatt didn't have time to question it, because the last thing Locke said before the signal cut was the one thing that truly terrified him. They're not here to win the war, Captain. They're here to erase it. And then the Dominion warship began to fall apart. The Dominion warship was dying. Its structure cracked and groaned under forces it was never designed to withstand. Bulkheads twisted, decks collapsed, and from the darkness came the sound of something feeding. Wyatt didn't look back. He sprinted toward the breach, his squad close behind, but the hull itself shuddered violently, throwing them to the floor. The ship was breaking apart from the inside out. Then a new transmission cut through the chaos. Get off that ship now. It was Vadran. Wyatt barely had time to process the order before a series of controlled detonations erupted across the Dominion flagship. The explosions didn't come from human weapons. This was surgical, precise detonations placed along structural weak points. The Dominion hadn't set them. Someone else had. The exiled fleet. The docking bay's blast doors blew outward as the breach widened. Wyatt grabbed hold of a support beam as atmosphere vented into the void. A Dominion officer slammed into the railing beside him, helmet shattered, face contorted in something that looked more like terror than pain. Before Wyatt could react, something black lashed out from the collapsing corridor, an elongated limb, shifting and pulsing as if it was both solid and liquid at the same time. It wrapped around the soldier's torso and pulled. The Dominion screamed. Wyatt let go. He tumbled through the breach, spinning wildly before his thrusters engaged, stabilizing his descent. Below him, the black ship loomed, its surface bristling with active defenses, plasma bursts carving into incoming debris. His comm flared with overlapping voices, tactical readouts, fleet movements, warnings. But none of it mattered, because above him, something impossible was happening. The Dominion warship wasn't just failing, it was unraveling. Sections of it bent and twisted at impossible angles, matter folding in on itself as if space-time had lost all meaning. A ripple of energy pulsed outward, distorting everything in its wake. Ships lost navigation. Sensors overloaded. Even the black ship's hardened systems flickered for a fraction of a second. Then, from the twisted wreckage, something stepped out. Wyatt didn't have the words for what he saw. It wasn't Dominion. It wasn't anything recognizable. It was tall, humanoid in shape but wrong in execution, its form shifting, as though it was never meant to be perceived. What remained of the Dominion crew opened fire, plasma bolts searing toward the figure. The shots never landed. They warped midair, bending around it. Then it moved. Not with speed. Not with force. With inevitability. One Dominion soldier raised a weapon, and the thing touched him. Nothing violent happened. The soldier simply ceased. Not vaporized. Not disintegrated. He was simply gone, as if he had never been there. Wyatt's instincts screamed at him to run. Vadron's voice cut through the comms, sharp, urgent. All ships, FIRE. The void exploded with light. The black ship led the charge, its heavy cannons unleashing hell. The fleet followed, thousands of energy bursts converging on the entity. The Dominion's remnants, desperate beyond reason, turned their weapons on it as well. It should have been enough firepower to reduce a dreadnought to slag. It didn't even slow it down. The entity raised a single hand. The stars flickered. And in that moment, every ship human, Dominion, exiled stopped moving. Not disabled. Not destroyed. Frozen. Wyatt was trapped in place, every muscle locked in stasis. His breathing halted. His mind remained intact, but his body no longer obeyed. Across every open channel, a sound emerged. Not a voice. Not words. Recognition. The entity knew them. Not as enemies. Not as rivals. As something far, far less. Then, impossibly, something answered. A signal. Ancient. Untranslated. It originated from the black ship. Not from its crew. Not from its systems. From the ship itself. A challenge. A warning. A name. And for the first time, the entity hesitated. The stasis shattered. Wyatt gasped as his body unlocked, his lungs burning. His ship's engines roared back to life. Weapons recharged. The fleet was moving again. But so was it. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He punched his thrusters and dove back toward the black ship. Because whatever was about to happen, the entity moved. So did the black ship. It wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. There were no weapons exchanged, no fleet maneuvers or desperate countermeasures. Whatever the ship truly was, whatever slumbering force had been buried within its hull, had been waiting for this moment. Its surface shifted, not physically, but in a way that felt like it was peeling back the centuries, shedding the disguise of a mere war vessel. The entity paused. The flickering distortion that surrounded it rippled outward, as if testing something unseen. Then it took a step forward. And the black ship answered. The void itself trembled. Space buckled. The Dominion remnants, the human fleet, the exiled forces all became witnesses to something beyond their comprehension. The two beings, one ancient, The other unknowable clashed in silence, their confrontation not fought with weapons, but with something deeper. Then it ended. The entity, whatever it had been, whatever its purpose, ceased to exist. No explosion. No sound. Just a sudden, crushing absence, as if it had never been there at all. Wyatt didn't breathe until the stars stopped shifting. The Dominion ship, what was left of it, hung motionless, gutted beyond repair. The exiled fleet hesitated, their weapons still primed, but they didn't fire. The human fleet, battered and barely holding together, waited for orders that no one knew how to give. Then Vadran's voice, raw and final, cut through the silence. "It's over." The words didn't feel real. Not yet. But they were. Wyatt returned to the black ship, stepping onto its deck with the weight of a man who had seen something no one else ever should. Rhaegor was waiting, his face unreadable, his tactical mind already processing the aftermath. Kaler, bloodied but standing, nodded in grim acknowledgement. Lysara was quiet, her hands resting against the console that had gone dark in the final exchange. No one spoke of what had happened. Because deep down, they knew. The war with the Dominion was done. The fleet scattered, their empire shattered beyond repair. But what they had faced, the thing that had stepped through the wreckage, was something older, something humanity had never been meant to see. And the black ship had known it, had recognized it, had fought it. Wyatt looked at the walls around him, the ship that had carried them through hell and back. It was quiet now, resting, but he knew it would not sleep forever. A transmission came through, encrypted, urgent. A distress beacon, human in origin, broadcasting from deep space. Not Dominion. Not exiled. Something else. Wyatt exhaled, exhaustion pulling at his bones, but the fire in his chest remained. He turned to Vadran, who was already watching him, already knowing what came next. "This isn't the end," Wyatt muttered. "No," Vadran agreed. "It never was." And as the black ship's engines roared back to life, humanity prepared to meet whatever came next.